Hey everybody, this is Gary Hughes, and I wanted to do a quick tutorial video on something that I figured out recently that I really like, and it's dealing with a very persistent problem that you get a lot in photography, even with good hair and makeup, that you can still get specular highlights on the skin, those shiny patches of skin, especially if you're dealing with anybody. The darker the skin tone gets, the more that those reflections of those lights become obvious, because that's exactly what it is. It's just the reflection of the light on their faces. And so one of the things I see a lot of photographers do is they retouch this, and it always ends up looking flat, or it ends up looking too much skin softened, And then the more you get into professional retouching and you're dealing with clients, they don't want to look fake. They want to look good, but they don't want to look fake. So this is a way that I have used to deal with it in the past. Previously, I would just take my clone stamp tool, and for those of you who are layers people, let's go ahead and copy that background layer by hitting Command or Control J, or you can drag that background layer to the new layer palette, boom, and there you go. At this point, I would typically grab the clone stamp tool, set it to the blend mode to darken at about 30%, and then if you zoom in on the area that you want to work with, let's say this forehead that's shiny, you want to take a real big soft brush. I usually take this at about 300. And then you select an area that's darker than the one you want to use, because when that blend mode is on darken, the clone stamp tool is only going to affect areas that are brighter than the area you selected from. So I would grab this, and then I would just sort of go around the edges and then reduce it that way. And what's cool about it is this definitely works in a lot of cases. However, one of the problems is that you get this sort of out of focusy, blurry kind of look, because you're still affecting the texture of the skin and not just the brightness. So although I've used that method, and it doesn't look terrible, but I want to up my game. So although that I've used that method for a long time, let's go ahead and get rid of that layer. Boom. I've discovered that using kind of a newer method that people have been talking about for a little while, but using it in a different way. Now, if you're in the headshot game at all and you watch tutorials or you're on the internet, you've probably heard the term frequency separation. And basically what that means is it's when you take the light and dark patchy areas of skin and you separate that from the actual texture of the skin. And then you can edit those things separately so that you can affect the bright and dark areas and the color tones without affecting the actual texture of the skin. So one of the cool things about the internet is that we don't have to do all this stuff from scratch. I use an action that I downloaded, a free action from Phlearn.com, Phlearn.com, and if you Google Phlearn frequency separation, there's a tutorial on how to set up your own, or you can just download the action they have for you. So what I'll do is I'll explain it to you a little bit, and I'll show you how it works. So I'm going to go to my actions, and I got tons of them. I'm going to select my frequency separation, and I'm going to hit play. And so what that's going to do, the first thing, it's going to create two separate layers over here, low frequency and high frequency. It's going to make the high frequency invisible, and then it's going to go to the low frequency and it's going to apply a Gaussian blur. So what that basically does is part of the action is going to have you choose the radius of that blur. And typically for a headshot type of orientation, when you're in that close, I find that with the camera that I shoot with, which for this image was the 5D Mark III, and on large RAW, that about 3.5 pixels of the radius will get you to the right level where it's just blurry enough to where you start to lose some of the detail in the skin, where you don't want it super blurry, you don't want it to look like that, but you want it to look where the skin is just out of focus. And that is a pretty good one right there. So I'm going to go ahead and hit OK. Then the action will continue to complete, and then it gives you a little instruction on what to do. But basically, if you break this down into open the group and look at the layers, you got low frequency and high frequency. Now the high frequency layer is essentially, it's kind of like a high pass filter that brings out way more detail than is in the original image. And that, coupled with the slightly blurry low frequency layer underneath, will give you pretty much an approximation of what the image looked like originally. But you can edit those separately. So what you have is high frequency, where you can edit the texture, and then you have low frequency where you can edit the skin, actually the tone of it. And so this will include sort of light and dark areas and patchiness. And so what I do is, instead of what typically is done, is where you would select large areas of skin with your lasso tool here. And you will basically, one of the ways they tell you to use this is to select these large areas of skin, like this, for example. Apply a feather to it. So I'm going to right click or control click and select feather. And then usually about 30 to 40. It's all going to depend on the size of selection. So I'm going to do about, let's say, 45. And now what that's going to do is soften the edges of the selection with the little marching ants around here. Now you take that area that you've selected and you're going to apply a Gaussian blur to it. So if you go to blur, Gaussian blur, and what this is going to do, this is going to really start to even out those areas of skin and make them look a little more uniform. The problem with this is that here's the original, and as you increase it, see how it'll start to smooth out those areas where you still have texture, but the skin tone itself is a little more uniform. The problem with this is it has a very specific look to it, and you can almost always tell when somebody's been editing by frequency separation. And I don't necessarily like that look for all my images, but I do like the concept of splitting these into two different frequencies. So instead of using that lasso selection as is typical, I will grab my clone stamp tool on darken at 30%, and I will use it on that low frequency layer and with that big soft brush. So if you do the same thing, take a selection, and you'll see that this time when I'm painting those bright areas, that it will darken the bright areas without blurring that nice texture in the skin that you want to keep. So you kind of get a similar effect, but you have a little more spot control over it. And so I have kind of a combination of the method that I used to use and the best parts of frequency separation. Now the thing about these specular highlights or these shiny areas is you don't want to eliminate them completely, because these specular highlights, as they're called, they give definition and roundness and dimension to shapes. So if you get rid of it completely, you'll lose the roundness of the face and it'll end up looking flat and fake, and you don't want that. So I always kind of go in there and I'll reduce them until I think that they look managed, and so that I have detail and still have dimension and everything looks pretty good. So let's just say we did that, and now I'll take it back and I'll look at it as a whole and I'll say, okay, that looks good, but I can see a little bit of where I've been, you know, it looks a little retouched. So what I'll typically do with any effect that I apply to an image is I will go to that effect, and over here I'm going to select this group, the frequency separation group. I'm going to reduce the opacity, usually to around 65, 70-ish%, something like that. And at that point, I'll start to see it. It will blend back with sort of the original image so that I don't overdo it. That way, my general rule is apply the effect and pull it back a bunch and just see what it looks like. So if you look at the original, we got those specular highlights that are a little out of control. And with this, they're there, but they're definitely under control, and you still have all that texture in the skin that looks normal. And it's a great way to get those specular highlights under control without making it look fake or overly processed. So that's one of my cool tips, and thanks to Flern for that free action that they give to everybody. And I appreciate you tuning in. I hope this helps you, and I'll see you in the next video.